When people ask what I do for a living, they inevitably follow up with the same question. What's the best watch then? It's the equivalent of asking a magician to show you a trick on the street. And like most magicians, I have my same go-to response. If you're on about the best build quality, in my experience, once you pay over $1,000, most watches are typically built to a similar standard. The recent Tag Kith collab notwithstanding, of course. I mean, 1,500 quid for a plastic watch, are you kidding? Typically though, past $1,000, most watches, they're built pretty darn well. And the differences are often down to brand prestige, heritage, and marketing costs more than a dramatic uptick in construction. It's a generalization, I understand that, and there are watches that buck this trend. But if I had to draw a childlike chart on the relationship between price and build, it's probably something like this. It's a game of diminishing returns, especially near the top end. The brand I'll be reviewing today has built its whole business on supposedly exploiting this phenomenon. They're Christopher Ward, a British company making waves in the luxury watch community in recent years. Now, if you've watched any of my videos before, then Christopher Ward's website might ring some alarm bells. As you can see, they're openly going after some of the big players in the watch industry in a similar manner to numerous fashion watch brands I've exposed over the years. They mention luxury markups, industry shakeups, and premium construction. I mean, some of these phrases are as close to verbatim as it gets. Even the almighty middlemen get a shout out. The main difference is these watches, they're not selling for 150, 200 quid, no, they're $1,000 each. £1,000 a pop, a completely different proposition. Across their site, they infer, if not directly claim, that their watches are made just as well as the big luxury brands that retail for multiple thousands. Specifically, I think they're positioning themselves at the point where the diminishing returns curve starts to level off completely. These are supposedly the lowest possible cost at which pretty much the maximum level of quality should be attainable, while removing as much of the brand tax as possible. I read all this after they reached out to me, right? And whenever I hear these sorts of claims, I'm immediately skeptical. I've reviewed some pretty stellar watches for well under the £1,000 mark. And it got me wondering, how do these stack up in reality? Instead of going upwards and comparing to Rolexes and Pateks, I'm much more interested to see how they compare to some of the best brands at say £200, £500 and 750 quid. Are they really that much better? I mean, I've heard people speak similarly of the Tissot PRX, calling that the lowest entry point into luxury watches as well. I'm also wary of this against the grain style messaging, which has gained notoriety in recent years. Are these watches, are they just a fancier version of the same old scam? Well, there's only one way to find out. So here are the two watches Christopher Ward sent in for review. For full disclosure, they haven't paid me any money for this video. However, they have since said I can keep one of these samples if I want to. They're pretty much at my cutoff here at Ben's Watch Club. If you're considering parting with this much cash, it's no small sum. So I'll aim to be as detailed as possible. I think they were extra keen to send me this pair as they are new 36mm versions of two of their most popular models, the Sealander 36 GMT, a sporty traveler's watch, and the 12, an integrated bracelet watch. I'm well known for my rather petite wrist, of course. Both of these models are linked in the video description if you want to take a look for yourself. If you're weighing up some of their other models, hopefully some of the points here will still prove useful. These watches were shipped in gorgeous, weighty wood and bamboo boxes that were clearly produced with tight tolerances. They open and close with a similar vacuum effect to high-end smartphone boxes, and even have tiny magnets that securely connect the insert to the surround. Very, very snazzy. Unlike many of the lower cost watches I review, where I'd rather they skim every penny on the box to reallocate resources to the actual watch, if you're dropping over $1,000, you'd want it to feel special. And I do think this is appropriately special without being overkill. Even the documentation perfectly slots into place for maximum OCD alleviation. And when you first see these watches in the flesh, it all adds up. Unlike some infamous brands I've covered before, Christopher Ward seems to have made a genuine, realistic attempt at this whole affordable luxury formula. They aren't just stamping a fancy name to a low-quality, dirt-cheap Chinese-made quartz watch, selling it for £200 and claiming it's now premium and disrupting the industry. These are Swiss-made, they've got big specs, and they are only on the very cusp of affordable for the everyman. So while the service level claims are similar, the products, they're very different. Okay, so they're not total junk, but are they the real deal? Don't worry, the scam brands, they'll be making a return soon. I know you guys missed them, but let's begin with the more reserved of the two, the Sealander C63 GMT. This is a new variant of the Sealander sports watch, which is supposedly one of their best-selling models. On paper, this isn't massively different from watches I've reviewed before, with the only standout spec on the list being the movement, which we'll get to shortly. Nevertheless, in the hands, it quickly became apparent that this was one of the best constructed watches I've come across. When it comes to 316L steel watches, the case finishing exhibited here is about as good as it gets. The brushed portions exude a satin-like sheen, while the polished areas are silky smooth to the touch. Christopher Ward calls this their light catcher case, which, although cheesy, is a surprisingly accurate moniker, as the sculpted shape, combined with the alternating surfaces, provides an intriguing array of reflections you won't find on more simplistic lower-end watches. Now, is this a world away from some of the best budget brands I've seen? No, I won't go that far. However, I do think it's approaching the ceiling of what is physically possible on a non-haute horology watch. What's great is the watch is already pretty slim, but this segmented shape and finishing gives the illusion of it being even thinner, to the degree that this automatic GMT rivals the dimensions of a quartz watch. It comes in with a width of around 36.4mm depending on where you measure, along with a 42.7mm lug-to-lug and 11.5mm thickness. That thickness includes a slightly raised crystal. This unisex version of the watch is perfect for me, with proportions clearly tailored to thin arms. For something meatier, the 39mm Sealander GMT is available in all the same colours, plus an additional hunter green version. Now, my pick for either would be the intoxicating Dragonfly Blue, which I think looks head and shoulders above the others from the online images. However, the only one Christopher Ward had available for sampling at this time was this more reserved black model, hence why it's here. I don't mind this dial. It's got a glossy, enamel-like sheen that still manages to retain the extreme legibility provided by all the white accents. The surface is very smooth and sleek, though the overall simplicity of the look does mean that similar dials can be had for less money elsewhere. In fact, this monochrome diver-inspired design reminds me a lot of the Casio EFE 100 series that I reviewed several years back, with the non-GMT version of this watch being an even closer match. As you might imagine though, even though they look a bit similar from a distance, given the gulfing cost, there is a huge difference when it comes to the finer details. The markers, for example, are beautifully executed, with wedge-like polished tips that catch the light at different angles than what I've come to expect from other watches. When you get even closer, their neatness and cleanliness becomes even more apparent. The double marker at 12 in particular is an unforgiving, risky choice that could quickly become an eyesore if the alignment were a fraction off. In fact, this is one of the most common imperfections I come across with handmade watches at all price points. Thankfully, both of the units I've got here avoid this issue. Like many premium watches, the handset of the Sealander GMT makes use of dual finishing techniques, with both brushed and polished portions on the two main hands. The minute hand is pretty standard fare, with a brushed central strip and a tip flanked by glossy strips on each side. Nevertheless, it's the first time I've seen such a short hour hand be treated in a similar manner. This sword arrow hybrid is mostly glossy, like many watches, but there's an unusual diamond-shaped section of brushing at the very tip, meaning that this section typically catches the light at different times than the rest of the handset does. I'm not sure whether I like it or not, but in certain scenarios, it does improve legibility a tad. Of course, we can't talk about these intricacies without mentioning the logo. This thing has been through the ringer. Years ago, Christopher Ward relied on written versions of their logo, often positioned off to the side. Occasionally, they would switch to a truncated Cr Ward version instead. Then they tried a contemporary, almost video game style typeface. In essence, if these logos weren't straight up ugly, they were busy throwing off the balance of the whole dial. Thankfully, in recent years, someone at Christopher Ward came to their senses and decided to overhaul the logo once and for all. Nowadays, their watches ship almost exclusively with their dual flag icon at the top center, which I'm sure presents some manufacturing challenges, but looks so much better. This represents Switzerland and England, the two countries that make up the DNA of Christopher Ward. Other elements of the watch still retain a written version of the branding that, while sedate, is at least inoffensive. I've gone from hating the branding to quite liking it. My only remaining gripe on this front is the actual name of the company. I've never loved product branding that sounds like you're just saying someone's name. Unlike Daniel Wellington or Filippo Loretti, Christopher Ward is at least a real guy. He's one of the co-founders, in fact, though he left the company a few years back to pursue other ventures. Most big watch brands seem to have single-word names, so I wonder if perhaps my preference is actually a result of social conditioning. Some of it could also be the tainting of this approach by the recent influx of those sketchy watch companies named after fictional individuals purely engineered for marketing purposes. Of course, the latter isn't Christopher Ward's fault, and it's too late for them to reconsider naming now. I'm just curious if any of you think the same. Something else I was initially frustrated by was the bracelet. Frustrated is definitely the right word here, not so much angry. You see, the bracelet that shipped with this sample is a butterfly deployant type. These look great when fitted, as they leave a sleek, uninterrupted appearance. However, getting said fit usually proves tricky. These clasps never really house any micro adjustment holes, with some models including shortened links as a mediocre compromise. Unfortunately, even these weren't present on the bracelet that shipped with the C63 GMT. As such, despite the £1,000 price tag, I couldn't find a comfortable fit. A watch nerd's worst nightmare. Luckily, it seems Christopher Ward foresaw my nightmare, as they were already finishing up a revamped version of this consort bracelet, which they shipped to me the following week. Not only does this have the aforementioned smaller links, offering up some level of tinkering, but also a discrete micro adjustment system, which is, to my knowledge, the first of its kind in the watch industry. The links on either side of the clasp now have built-in friction fit mechanisms, where you can lightly tug them to provide 1.5mm of wiggle room on each end. It's not a perfect solution. You are essentially separating the links, so you can see when the adjustment system is engaged if you look closely. Nevertheless, to my knowledge, nothing else like this exists at this price, and it doesn't add any bulk to the bracelet, so its inclusion is fantastic. If you're spending this much on a watch, you may be expecting designs or features that separate it from lower cost watches, and this pretty neat innovation, it does just that. Whether this system will ever make its way into their other watches, it remains to be seen, but it is set to be the default on the Sealander GMT in the near future. I don't have an exact date on that yet. Across the top of the watch is a piece of sapphire that stands proud from the bezel. It's the only acceptable material here from a scratch resistance perspective, and while they don't market it as any sort of selling point, the final result is crystal clear, with none of the murkiness you'll often find on cheaper sapphire. While scratches will always be a threat, water is also somewhat of a concern. The last thing you want is your $1,000 watch perishing the second you wash your hands. Here, the Sealander GMT lives up to its name, with a high 15 ATM water resistance rating, so long as the crown and rear remain screwed. Oddly, these are two of my favourite parts of this watch. Not sure I've ever said something like that before. There's no other way of saying it. This is the best crown I've ever operated. It truly is silky smooth with virtually silent operation, boasting the perfect amount of tension with no roughness or looseness at any point. In other words, the Goldilocks of watch crowns. Of course, it screws in to create the best seal possible, and it's got sufficient grip paired with the dual flag logo. Something that also immediately struck me was the caseback. If you've watched many wristwatch videos on YouTube, you're probably accustomed to the square and circular notches dotted around the outside. These are designed as slots for caseback removal tools, so the movement within can be inspected or serviced with relative ease. Here though, these cutouts are extended in a trench-like manner, with a blasted finish lining the inside. I've never seen this on a watch before, so I asked my contact if these horological hot dogs had a particular purpose or were more of an aesthetic choice. He confirmed it was indeed the latter. To that end, I think these provide a fairly elegant and unique twist on an element that's often overlooked. I've never seen anything quite like it, and unlike some brands' proprietary casebacks, its removal won't require custom tools. Whatever you think of the cutouts, sat between them is the all-important movement. This is the Sellita SW330-2, a Swiss GMT movement with a fairly smooth tick rate of 28,800 beats per hour. It's the same model as in the larger 39mm version of this watch, and you'll quickly notice it's not the flashiest movement out there. It isn't as eye-catching as the highly decorated Mind GMT I looked at a couple of years back, for example. Nevertheless, this heavily modified ETA 2893-2 clone has some party tricks up its sleeve. Firstly, some of the upgrades have given this baby a mighty 56-hour power reserve, even with the fairly high beat rate. This is an office or caller type GMT, so you can't adjust the hour hand independently, but you can quick set the GMT hand instead. This unit is running at approximately -2 seconds per day, which is great. It has hacking, hand winding, and more. You can check out the super nerdy details elsewhere. What's most impressive to me is how tightly packed this Sellita is in its housing. CW has left barely any space whatsoever between it and the glass rear, as you can see. You get the impression that they set out to trim as much unnecessary fat as possible, had the culinary precision to successfully pull it off. Apparently, there are 3 versions of this movement that brands can pick from. From the listings for this watch, they appear to have gone with the lowest tier's Special or Elaboré grade, which has a fairly subtle something or spiral finish across most of the surfaces. The rotor is a little more eye-catching, with a custom design that features microscopic Christopher Ward logos combined with a text-filled rim. Overall, the C63 Sealander is a very high-quality watch that also looks like a high-quality watch. Despite this, the finished look isn't totally to my taste. If I were to pay this much money for a watch, I'd want it to look a little more special. The Black Sealander GMT, it just doesn't have the unique pizzazz or X factor that would urge me to part with so much cash. For me, $1,000 is a hell of a lot of money. The Dragonfly Blue version, now that may be a different story, but I'm yet to see it in the flesh. On that note, we have another watch to discuss, one that may pack the added punch I'm looking for. This is the 12 Sports Watch, the same one that several YouTube reviewers were drooling over, only this time in a 36mm case size. While other watches from Christopher Ward have received praise over the years, I think it's fairly obvious why the 12 generated such a buzz. The dial here is far more intricate than that on the Sealander, or most other watches I've looked at for that matter, with micro texturing that has, inevitably, given the integrated bracelet design, led many people to compare it to the Tissot PRX. Now, the PRX is a watch I've finally been able to try recently, and I'll go more in depth shortly, but so far as the dials go, the CW is different gravy. True, the waffle dial on the PRX looks good and is the no-brainer choice versus the plainer Tissot models. However, that on the 12 offers an extra layer of complexity and finesse. If we zoom right in, you'll see that it's constituted of mini crosses, no doubt a reference to their flag iconography, with each end tapered downward, creating this interlocking pattern which creates a much more reactive shimmer effect that elevates this dial to the next level. I mean, just look at it as you move it in the light. There's no doubt this looks awesome, and the final result is much more impressive than many more expensive watches that I've handled or seen in the shop windows. Nevertheless, this extra dimension does reduce legibility more significantly than the more regimented finish on the PRX, especially for lighter colors like this frosted lichen version, though I wouldn't call it a deal breaker. The markers remind me a little of those on the popular Orient Komatsu, only taken up a notch with two-tone finishing and an even pointier structure that combines nicely with the lance-shaped handset. They sit just inside of a slim, raised color-matched chapter ring, and they're only accompanied by very limited text, namely the word automatic just above 6, and the illustrious Swiss-made title at the bottom. I've never been a massive advocate for Swiss-made, given that the Swiss-made label often doesn't mean that all the components have actually been made in Switzerland, and that other countries are making fantastic watches nowadays. It doesn't carry such a huge amount of weight to me. That said, it essentially guarantees that most workers in the production chain are in good working conditions, and it also means that Christopher Ward is matching most luxury brands on this front. Many similarly priced or lower cost brands are made elsewhere, reducing the scope for a like-for-like comparison. Of course, they're going to save money on cheaper labor. On both models, I haven't been able to spot any quality control errors. That even includes the segmented logo, which is also applied in a neater manner than that on the Tissot PRX. It sits straight on top of the uneven surface without any outline or border. This frosted lichen is somewhat of a turquoise color, and in person looks a touch more blue than the rather green stock images. The my pick would probably still be one of the darker tones instead. The case on this model is a little bit unconventional. From the side, you'll see that the case is essentially lopped off at the lug area at a slight reverse angle. It almost looks like a robot's torso, with the bracelet acting as the arms protruding from the creature's shoulders. This is one part of the watch I was intrigued by, as the layout here is the opposite of some other sports watches, with a built-in male end link that protrudes outwards. Despite this, the 36mm 12 kind of has more wiggle room than the 35mm PRX, whose second links are virtually fixed in place too. While the case finishing is just as good as the Sealander, the shape is much straighter, which means you'll usually get a bit of space underneath the lugs during wear. The Sealander and PRX both give a flusher look, which I tend to prefer. One thing the Gap does leave room for is the quick release bracelet system, which is also new to me. Unlike most quick release bracelets where the tabs are on the strap itself, here they're baked directly into the underside of the lugs, as an extra part of the case if you will. Functionally, mainly due to the increased size of these tabs, these are way easier to use, and in my testing, I've not once gotten them stuck between my nail and nail bed. As for the bracelet itself, it integrates perfectly. It has exactly the same continuation of vertical brushing as the main body, and while similar, it boasts chamfers down each flank, so it looks a little nicer than that on the PRX. Their efforts even extend to the clasp. This butterfly clasp has the same brushing and polishing as every other part of the bracelet. The first time I've seen such a thing attempted. Is this significant? No. Is it clear they've tried to go the extra mile? On this occasion, yes. Something I want to mention here is that on my Tissot PRX unboxing on my unboxing channel, a lot of you said that the PRX bracelet scratches really easily. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't spend long enough with that watch to study that over the long term. And while such a sentiment doesn't seem to be shared about this 12 bracelet, I no longer have the PRX at hand to do a long-term comparison. At present, the 1236mm includes some shorter links by default, like the PRX and many other integrated bracelet watches. However, it doesn't have the clever extension system found on the new Sealander bracelet. Hopefully they consider introducing that across the board because it would work really well with a watch like this. Now, I did encounter an issue when sizing both of these bracelets. It's funny because I generally love screw links. They're a dream to size at home for most people, and they reduce the chances of scratching the bracelet. That's what Christopher Ward has gone for here. In theory, these should be better than the push pins used in the PRX. Nevertheless, several of these were far too tight, resulting in me damaging the screw heads during extraction. While I'm no dentist, given the sheer number of bracelets I adjust every week with my specialist tools, I don't think my technique or gear is to blame. I think it's something Christopher Ward needs to look into. Now, I did eventually get it sized, and on the wrist, the 1236 fits me really well, and I'd say marginally better than the 35mm PRX, which just about verges on too small. My wrist is 6¼ inches for reference, and with my current camera setup, most watches they tend to look a tiny bit bigger on camera than they do in person. With the crown guards, it's about 37.2mm wide. Without them, it's somewhere in the region of 35.8. Paired with a thickness of 10.4, including a raised crystal. The lug-to-lug is very much up for debate given the end-link arrangement I just mentioned. If you're wondering why it's called the 12, well, that's because of the bezel. You'll see it has 12 sides. Simple. What's particularly neat is that this aligns perfectly with a 12-sided case rear on the underside, which we'll get into in a moment. Now, I appreciate that Christopher Ward hasn't opted for a run-of-the-mill smooth bezel or octagonal bezel. I mean, we've seen those all before, haven't we, at this point? Nevertheless, I can't help but feel that I don't love it. I can't put my finger on exactly why. I don't hate it, I'm just not 100% feeling it. The same can be said for the crown guards, which are sort of bolted on the side with hexagonal screws. Proportionally, I think the crown and the guards are maybe a little too big, considering the small case size. Still, overall, it is a good looking watch, but again, I'd go for one of the other colors. One worry I had with this particular shape is that, again, I assumed the case back would present a challenge. You see, this version of the 12 completely lacked any sort of case opening holes, leading me to suspect it would involve a custom fit tool, such as those used to remove the back of Rolex watches. Well, it turns out that this isn't a screw back at all. Surprisingly, it's a snapback rear, with a minuscule gap under the 9 o'clock for sliding in a regular prizing tool or knife. Christopher Ward told me that there wasn't space for the screw arrangement present on the larger 40mm model, but did assure me that their 100-meter water resistance claim was valid. Now, I imagine this won't be a huge issue for most of you, considering this watch, your watchmaker will probably be doing all the fiddling for you. Nevertheless, given that most watchmakers use these expensive and highly effective case removal tools for screwbacks, I guess your watch is slightly more likely to get scratched from a snapback case removal tool. From my experience, there's just way more chance of that style tool coming loose. The crown is at least threaded like the Sealander and is again very smooth to use. Before we get to the movement, it's also worth mentioning that you can buy the 1236 in titanium. It's grade 2 titanium, it looks just as nicely finished as this steel one, though it is an extra 500 quid. That model comes in some slightly different colorways too, a few of which I think look even better. Okay, inside the 1236 is the same Sellita SW200-1 as in the 40mm version. It's a similar grade movement to that in the Sealander GMT, but has a lower 38-hour power reserve and obviously no GMT function. The crown operates the hands, and that's it. This movement is obtainable in lower cost watches, such as the Formex Field I reviewed in 2022. Though that was a lower grade version of the SW200. Otherwise, you get the same 8 beats per second as that in the GMT. This movement is widely used on watches in this price bracket, as well as in some watches that are around twice the price from my research. However, you usually won't find off-the-shelf movements like this in watches costing many times this one. Theirs are often heavily modified or just made in-house. This particular unit clocked in a more modest plus 12 seconds per day on average, which is well within spec, but not as accurate as some automatics I've reviewed recently. So what do I think overall then of Christopher Ward watches? Would I buy their watches? Would I buy one of these? And should you? Well, I think it's fair to say that these watches are, without question, made as well as you could expect for around the £1,000 mark. That's the crucial factor really. They didn't target a completely unrealistic price point. You'll never rival a luxury watch's level of quality at £150 or £200. That's impossible. Instead, their watches cost about £1,000, and they have other models that are as low as about £550 now. I think that just about leaves them with enough wiggle room to have a crack at giving these big companies somewhat of a run for their money. I think certain aspects of these watches are as good as most more expensive watches I've seen, if not better. The case finishing, the dial texture on the 12, and the bracelet innovation are all very impressive. Both models are noticeably better than the lower cost watches I tend to review on this channel, as they should be. The brand also has an aptly generous returns policy to go alongside their product offerings. And the key thing here is Christopher Ward has been around for so long, they're actually going to be still in business by the time you get towards the end of that warranty. From that perspective, I do think they are about where they pitch themselves on their site. That said, does that mean I would buy one? Well, I'm not sure I could justify spending this much money on any watch, regardless of quality. My earnings aren't the highest, so it would have to be something mind-blowing that I absolutely loved for me to consider parting with that much cash, when I know it could be spent on amazing, more meaningful things to me, like visiting new countries, my beautiful cats, or put towards important life goals like owning a home one day. Neither of these particular watches cross that threshold for me. I doubt I'd feel a great deal more satisfaction wearing a £1,000 watch every day versus one that's £500 or £600. The latter is usually sufficient for my needs and preferences. If you love the design of these watches or aren't so fiscally restricted, they are very well made and probably won't disappoint you. They're not a misleading scam named after a fictional character like many similarly posturing brands. And 99% of you probably won't be able to tell the difference between these watches and others that cost 2 or 3 times as much. You'd probably need a microscope. At the same time, it still takes a trained eye or a pretty good camera lens to notice the material differences between these watches and some of the best £600 watches I've reviewed. What I wouldn't do is go into a purchase like this expecting these watches to hold their value or increase in value. That's one of the next things I always get asked by newbies. I heard I can make money investing in Rolex, should I do it? While they've been going for 20 years now, Christopher Ward, they haven't accrued that same horde of speculators who are buying them purely for monetary reasons. And as such, the resale value is not going to be as good as the luxury brands whose build they may be rivaling. If you want to support this British brand, there are links to their watches in the video description. Did you know Casio made a luxury watch too? Watch the video on screen now to see what it is and whether it's worth owning one.